heard the scripture reading earlier, I'm going to talk today about one of the four texts for this week, which is the text in the book of chapter 16 of the Gospel of Luke. It is the parable called the parable of the shrewd manager. The parable of the shrewd manager. Now, I don't need to reread the story. As you heard the story, this guy, somebody went to the boss and said, "Are you aware that this guy is stealing from you?" And the boss said, "Well, I'll find out." So he calls him in and he says, "What is this that I hear that you are stealing from me?" And he gave him those famous words that Donald Trump made famous. "You are fired. But before you are fired, because you're doing my account, so I want you to go do all the books, bring them to me. Once that is done, you're gone." So this man then goes away. He realizes that, okay, I have a problem now. What am I going to do? So I thought I'll just talk about this parable this morning because it says so much about some of the things that we covered this weekend, both at the conference of the pastors and since we started the family retreat. Most biblical passages are difficult to read when you read them out of context. And this is one of those that have puzzled theologians many, many times. Why did Jesus tell this story? Who was he telling it to? What is he telling us today? In the story, he commends this guy who goes away, and to the people that owed his master, he says, "How much did you owe?" The other guy says, 900. He says, "Okay, slash it by half. Only pay half of that." He goes to the other one and says, "How much do you owe?" He says, 1,000. He says, "Okay, slash it by 20%. Only pay 800. So he seems to be cheating his boss even some more. And he says he's doing it so that he can make friends with these people that he's giving these big discounts to. So that when he loses his job, he has other people who can help him. Now, you will expect Jesus to say, this guy is a bad guy. But he commends him. He says, this is a shrewd, wise man. Now, shrewd in this case is not a bad word. When shrewd is used in business, when say it's a shrewd businessman, we mean he's a wise businessman. He knows how money is made in business. If you are not a shrewd businessman, you will never make business. But shrewdness is not the same thing as being corrupt and bad. But in this case, we can see he was being corrupt and something that Jesus commends. So is Jesus encouraging dishonesty by commending this guy? Some have thought that is what he's doing. So I would like us to understand this parable by briefly looking at the context in which he was telling it. Because if we don't understand the context, we don't know why he was telling the story in the first place. And therefore we miss the point. When somebody tells a joke, normally there's a context in which the joke is told. There are jokes I can tell here, and there are jokes I can tell at work in the office to my colleagues. And there are jokes comedians can tell in a hall full of people who have come to listen to comedy. So even jokes have a context in which they are told. You can't just tell them anywhere, or they won't make any sense. And the secret of a joke is in the punchline. You can hear the whole story of a joke, but if you miss the punchline, you'll find other people laughing and you don't know why they're laughing. Because you miss the point. Because the point is not the story. And so in many of the parables that Jesus tells, the point is not the story he's telling you. The point is the point he makes at the end, the punchline, as we call it. So we will need to look for that punchline. But it's easy to lose the punchline if you don't know what the context is. So what is the first clue we get in this parable? It is in verse 1 of chapter 16 of the Gospel of Luke. So if you have Bibles, stay in chapter 16 of the Gospel of Luke. I'm going to stay there for most of the time. So in verse 1 it says, he also said to his disciples. Now I know some of you, your Bibles say, he said to his disciples. Does anybody have a Bible that says, he said to his disciples? Pastor Kai's Bible says that. Anybody? Okay. There is a missing word. And that word is the word also. Okay. Now, in the original, the word also is there. But somehow, many translations think it is not relevant because they translate this parable out of context. Okay? So, verse 16 is a follow-up on chapter 16 follows on chapter 15, where he told other parables. So when he gets to chapter 16, Luke says he also told them about this parable. Okay? So to understand this parable, you must understand the context in which he was telling. There were stories that he was telling, and this is just one of them. So when you don't have the word also in verse 1, you think this is a new section, a very new thing that Jesus is now talking about, which is unrelated to what he was saying before. So that's the first clue. The first clue is that this parable links to the previous parables he was telling, because Luke says he also told them about this parable, in addition to the other ones he told them. The second clue is also in verse 1. He says, this man was wasting his goods. This man was wasting the wealth of his master. Now, the word waste had been used in chapter 15. Okay? And how was it used in chapter 15? In chapter 15, it was used of the prodigal son, who the father gave the wealth, and he goes and wastes it. Okay? So the two stories are related. So in this story, we are being told a story that relates to the previous parable. In this story, it is a manager who is wasteful. In the previous chapter, it was a son who was wasteful. So there's something to do with wastefulness in both stories. So Jesus is making a point about being wasteful. The third clue that we find in the parable to help us understand it is in verse 14 of chapter 16. This is the end. So we read up to verse 13, but verse 14 is also still part of the story. Okay, but we didn't go there because of time. But I'm going to bring it in so that you can see the context. So in verse 14 of chapter 16, he says, now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, also heard these parables. Now when you go to the beginning of chapter 15, you realize that the parables in chapter 15 were told to the Pharisees. But so when he finished telling the stories to the Pharisees in chapter 15, in chapter 16, in verse 1, he then turns to his disciples. But the Pharisees are still around. But this time he's talking to his own disciples. So the previous stories were told to the Pharisees. This one is told to the disciples, but the Pharisees are still around to hear it. So in verse 14, Luke tells us, the Pharisees who were lovers of money also heard this thing, this story that was being told. Now the next clue, the fourth clue, which is the last clue to help us understand this, is also in chapter 1. In verse 1 of chapter 16, where it says, there was a rich man. Okay? Verse 1 of chapter 6 says, there was a rich man. Now, when you go further down in chapter 16, there is another rich man we are told about, who is a different parable. The rich man of the story of the rich man and Lazarus. You know the story? Where the rich man dies, Lazarus dies, they go to the other side, and the poor man Lazarus is with Abraham's bosom, and the rich man is in a place where he's being tormented. Okay? So the two stories are also linked. So the next story that comes after this one is also linked to this one. Okay? So we have wastefulness and we have rich men in the stories that are being told between chapter 15 and chapter 16. So let's summarize the context. before I then move into what are the lessons for us today. So all the stories in chapter 15 and 16 are firstly about money and wealth. Okay? The first two stories in chapter 15, if you don't know, I will just remind you. They're about the lost sheep. We talked about a shepherd who has 100 sheep, and one gets lost, and he leaves the 99, and he goes to look for the one that is lost. And he finds it and brings it home. The next story, he tells them also about a woman who loses one of her 10 coins in the house. So she searches throughout the house until she finds the one missing coin. And then she calls her friends to come and rejoice with her for having found the lost coin. And then the next two stories are about wastefulness. So the first two are about lostness, the lost sheep, the lost coin. The next two stories are about wasteful. The wasteful son, and now the wasteful manager of the story we're talking about. Now, as we said, the reason for these stories was, as we saw in the beginning of chapter 15, verse 2, where the Pharisees and scribes complained, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." So the first two stories about lost sons were told to show why is Jesus spending time with a lost cause, if you like. Jesus was spending time with sinners, people he should not be bothering with, according to Pharisees. And then he told those two stories of the lost sheep and the lost coin to show that the Father cares about the lost sheep. And he wants us to care about the lost sheep. That's why the love venue is so critical for the church. That's why Jesus came. Okay? So that's the point that we need to make. But what is common also amongst these stories? What does the man who finds this lost sheep do? What does the woman who finds the lost coin do? What does the father who finds his lost son do? What does the shrewd manager do when he learns that he has just been fired? There's one thing they all do. You know what they all did? What did the shepherd do when he found his one sheep? He rejoiced with who? He called his friends and had a party. Celebrated. What did the woman do when she found a lost coin? She called a friend and celebrated. Now, how do people celebrate? Do you think they came and sat around and she just said, "Look, I found my coin"? No. She prepared a meal. She had a party. She probably bought a cake or baked a cake. They had a party. And you might say, what a waste. The party cost probably more than the one coin you found. For the lost sheep, when this guy comes back with the one lost sheep, the party he throws for his friend probably needs a whole sheep slaughtered. What a waste. The very sheep you thought you found, now it's gone. Okay? So at face value, these stories do not make sense because they look wasteful. The father, this son, has just gone and wasted all the wealth that he gave him. He comes back and throws a bigger party and wastes more. That's what these stories are telling us. But also what it's telling us, apart from the rejoicing, is about the friends and the friendships that are being made. And I think the number one point, we'll come to that, but let me make it now. The number one point Jesus is making is that when it comes to making friends and connections and reaching out to people, there is no cost. When it comes to reaching out to people and making friends with them so that they can be saved, there is no cost. You don't spare a cent. You spend whatever it takes to spend. That's what it means. Yesterday we heard, those for you who were not here, we heard briefly from Pastor Okai about the story of the king who wants to throw a wedding for his son. And you know, the way we know weddings today, kings throw 20, 100 times the kind of weddings we throw because they have the money. So we heard in that story that he invited people, the honorary guests, the who's who of society. We know that when there is a famous wedding happening, it is the who's and who's of our society who are invited, not you and me. And that's what that king did. He invited the who's and who's of society. And all of them were busy with other things. They said, no, sorry, we can't come. Then he got no response. Then he said to his servants, now go into the streets. Anybody you find, whether they are good or bad, it doesn't matter, invite them to come to my son's party, to my son's wedding. And they go and do that. So on top of the fact that he has thrown this lavish party, wedding ceremony for his son, remember the servants that he sends out, they are on his payroll. Okay, he's not. So the people who get sent out are on payroll. People who need to go to the street corners are on payroll. They need money to be able to go out. We talked about the love venue. It's going to demand lots of money for us to reach out into the world. Okay? So he sends these servants to go out and call these people to come in. So that's what the context of the story is. So I would like us to then go to the 3 points I think Jesus wants to make from this parable. There might be more, but I've decided I'm going to focus on these 3. So the first lesson from this parable of the shrewd man, we find it in verse 9 of chapter 16. He says, and I say to you, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon. So he calls money and wealth unrighteous. But he says, make friends with that stuff. Use the unrighteous money, use the unrighteous wealth, use whatever wealth you have, whatever money you have, to make friends for yourselves. So that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. Now, we know why the shrewd man did what he did. He said, I'm going to go to the people who owe my master. I'm going to give them huge discounts so that when I'm down and out without a job, if I knock on their door, they will say, yes, but this man saved me 50% of what I used to owe. What is a small thing for your friend? So come in. Okay? So he did that. But Jesus here, and this is where the punchline of the story is. This man was looking for temporary dwellings until he dies. But Jesus says, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into everlasting home. So this is not about you finding a home to stay the day you are homeless. This is about you finding a place for eternity. This is about eternity. This is about everlasting home. And we know about the story of the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man did not make many friends with Lazarus. He treated Lazarus like a nobody. We hear that Lazarus used to eat from the scraps that fall from the table. Okay. So he was not even, sometimes we know that servants don't sit at the table of the master to eat with the master. But at least there is a dish for them. Somebody dishes for them. Even though they go and sit outside to eat, at least there is a meal for them. That was not so with Lazarus. Lazarus ate from the leftovers that were supposed to be given to the dogs. He ate that. Because the rich man was not willing and no time for him. And we know in that story that Lazarus, when they were on the other side, he could not receive the rich man. The rich man cried and said, Lazarus, you were in my house. You know me. Please negotiate on my behalf that I can come the other side. And he was told, no, it can't be done. It can't be done. It's too late. So the friends must be made now, friends that will last for eternity. So when we go out in outreach, in the love venue we talked about, we are going out because we want people that will be with us for eternity. That's what we are going after. So he's saying use your money to bring people to Christ, because when they are in Christ, they will be your friends forever. Now, if I'm going to get a friend forever, how much should I spend in that friendship? How much should I spend in getting that friendship? There's no price to it. Whatever it takes. And that's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, what I'm sending you to do, when I'm sending you into the street corners, to go find both people who think they are good and those who think they are bad, I don't want you to spare anything. Go and find them and bring them here for the wedding banquet. And you and I are at work preparing for the ultimate wedding banquet of all, the banquet of our Lord Jesus Christ. And he says, use your money to bring people who will be everlasting friends into an everlasting abode, an everlasting home. That's the first point I believe Jesus is making in this story. The second lesson is that he who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much. And he who is unjust in what is least is also unjust in much. Generosity, brothers and sisters, is not a function of how much you have. Generosity is not a function of how much you have, how much you earn, where you stay, whether you already have a house or a car or not. It is not a function of that. I've heard people who say, I'm saving for my car, so once I've saved up and I buy the car, then I'll start giving. Okay? I'm saving for the deposit for my house, and once I have my house pay the deposit of the house, and then I'll start giving. I'm trying to play the lotto. If I win 5 million, I'll donate 1 million. Jesus says you are fooling yourself. If you are not faithful with 1 rand, you will not be faithful with 1,000 rand. You will not be faithful with 1,000,000 rand. We know the story of Ananias in the book of Acts. He says to the disciples, I have some wealth, I have some properties. I see we need money to help the poor. I'll go and sell. You see, I don't know how many you had. You probably had 20, 30 properties. Normally the rich have many properties. So he said, 1 property is no big deal. I can sell 1 property and bring the money here. And he does. He goes and sells 1 property. But when the cash was in his hands, it was no longer easy to release. And that's the danger of money. I always tell this story, and I'll repeat it here to make the point. This shirt that I'm wearing, I won't tell you how much it costs. But if any of you ask me, say, I like that shirt, would you mind giving it to me? How easy will it be? How difficult or easy will it be for me to give it to you? Easy. I'll take it off and I'll give it to you. But if I first sell it for what it is worth, and I've cash in my hand, do you think I'll give you that? Okay. So if you ask me for this shirt, I'll give it to you. And this shirt is at a minimum worth probably 500 rand. But if you ask me for 500 rand, I won't give you 500 rand. So there is a difference between money and things. Our attitude to things is different to our attitude to money. There are times when, earlier this year, when we had some disasters, and I said in my update, we're asking for donations. And I don't want to discourage people who did what they did, but I just want to make the point. Please understand the context. There are people who said, yes, we are starting a campaign, we are collecting clothes and food and so on to help in Mozambique or wherever the case may be. And I said to some of them, whatever you have collected, go and sell it and give me the money. It will be easier for me to send Emmanuel money in Mozambique than to ship a truckload of clothes and food. You think they went and sold the stuff and bring me the cash? Because it is not the same thing. There was a hurricane in the Bahamas the past 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago. In the website they wrote, they say, we know there are many of you who want to help, you want to send food, we'd rather you send us money. It's easier for us to move money into Bahamas. We can buy stuff there. So if you do have old clothes that you feel like donating, you can stand in a street corner, you can discount them as much as you want so that they can sell quickly, and take that money and give it. It's easier to do that. But most of us, once we have sold the stuff, we will halve the money and give half of it. Because money is difficult to let go of. And Jesus, in the parable as you saw in verse 14 of chapter 16, he says, the Pharisees who were also listening, who were lovers of money. And often when we read the Bible as Christians, we tend to be derogatory of the Pharisees. Many times we are the Pharisees, brethren. Many times we are lovers of money like them. Many times we think like them when it comes to money. We are not willing to give it. We'll rather hold on to it. And Jesus says, be faithful with the little or with much you have. So this is the point I'm making to you. If you think you are not making any free will offerings on a regular basis today because you earn too little, let me tell you the secret. Even if you got a promotion tomorrow which gives you 3 or 4 times or 10 times your current salary, you will still not be able to give. If you earn 1,000 rand a month and you give your 10% or 5% or 15% from that, it doesn't matter how much you earn, you will always give that. Because if you are faithful with little, you will always be faithful with much. But if you are not faithful with little, you will not be faithful with much. No matter how much you can convince yourself that's not the case, Jesus knows us. It is the case. That's what will happen. So if you are not one of those who are giving anything, and you are hoping one day God will bless you and you'll start giving, God is blessing you today. He might be blessing you with 100 rand, but it is still a blessing from Him. And you can be faithful with that. It will become 10,000, 1,000, and you can be faithful with that. It will become 10,000. You can be faithful with that. It will become 100,000, and you will remain faithful. Because it is not about how much you have. It's whether you are a faithful person. The little or the much you have, are you a faithful person? Now, I look at the records of the income in the church. I can see people who earn very little, who are very faithful. I can see people who are earning a lot, who are very faithful. But I can also see people who earn very little, who are not faithful. And I can also see people who are earning a lot, who are not faithful. So the difference is not how much you earn. The difference is, are you faithful with what you have, or are you not? Let's move to the third and last lesson I believe the story is about. In verse 13, it says, no servant can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. God says, Sometimes cannot can be a lose. He says you cannot do it. Almost like saying it's impossible to serve God and wealth or money. You can't do it. If you are not faithful with little, you will not be able to serve God with your money. Because the money gives us an illusion of invincibility. Money becomes God. Money becomes God. When we are sick, instead of calling the pastor to anoint us first, who do we think to call first? Our doctor. Because we have our medical insurance, we can easily go to the doctor and flash our medical aid card and we get the help we need. Money makes us feel invincible. When you are hungry, you don't need to pray. You take out your wallet, you go to the nearest takeaway and you order the burger or the pizza or the meal you want. Why do you need God? Your provisions is taken care of. Money makes us think that we don't need God. That's why you cannot serve God and money or wealth. Because the two stand opposed to each other. And the only way we can overcome that danger is to serve God with the money. Because where your heart is, that's where your treasure is. If you don't treasure God, you won't treasure Him with your money. And this is the point that Jesus is making here. That you will either hate God and love your money, or you will love God and hate the money. And when you hate the money, what do you do with it? You give it. You don't hoard it. You don't hold on to it. You give it to those that need it. Now, this past weekend at the conference, we discussed something called the love venue, which is where we as a church gather for the purpose of spreading the gospel out. Wherever it is, when we are gathered to spread out the gospel, we call that the love venue, because it's an expression of the love of God for the lost. Remember the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son, that demonstrates the love of God for the lost. God loves that. That's why we're calling the love venue. It's about expressing the love of God for the lost. He wants everybody to be saved. And for those that were not there, I did say to the pastors that in the past we used to fool ourselves by saying that it's not about numbers. It's about the quality of the Christian. As long as the 5 of us are growing in grace and knowledge, that's great. We don't need to have more people. We don't need to go and have outreach. And it is about numbers. That's why the good shepherd, when he loses 1 out of 100, they are no longer 100, and he cares about the fact that they are no longer 100. God does not want anybody to be lost. And if you think the 5 of you, because they are saved and they are growing in grace and knowledge, and therefore you are fine, the 5 of you can make it and the rest can go to hell. That's not how God thinks. God cares about numbers. That's why the woman who loses 1 coin, she doesn't say, it's just 1 cent. She goes to look for the 1 cent. That's why the father who loses his son, who has wasted all of that and he still has 1 son, he doesn't control himself by saying, but I still have the other son. I'm still a rich man. He still wants his lost son. That's the heart of God. And that's the heart we must have as churches. Now, to do that in this world, we need what Pastor Emmanuel in a conference over the weekend called infrastructure. We need physical infrastructure. We need buildings. We are sitting here now. There are people who are sitting under the tent outside. There are people sitting outside the door because we don't have space to house everybody in one roof. You know the reason why we can't do that? Because we don't have the money to break this thing down and build a bigger one. We don't have money to do that. Many of our churches are meeting in garages, in people's homes, in rented halls, and they can chase us anytime they want. We can't preach the gospel that way. We can't. Our current pastorate is all bivocational. They are not paid for what they do. The 7 that the king sent out into the streets, they were paid by him. We are sending pastors out to do work they are not paid for. Not even to cover their costs to come to church to look after you. We can't give them 100 rand to pay for their petrol. It takes money to do this. And God says, and Jesus says, you cannot love God and money at the same time. But if you love God, you'll throw your money at you. That which we love, we throw money at it. I told those that were here over the weekend that I have a friend. He's fanatical about cars. He buys the most expensive cars. And his Sundays are dedicated to washing his cars. His friends and his family know that. He wakes up in the morning on a Sunday morning, he has breakfast, and then he starts washing his car. He takes out the vacuum cleaner, the hose pipes, everything. He goes through the motions. It's a several hours ritual that he does every Sunday. Because that's where his wealth is. That's where his treasure is. We should not be like the Pharisees, who were lovers of money. But many times we are. And we need to change that. We need to change that. Holiness is part of that. Yesterday we heard about the pursuit of holiness. That's what holiness means. Holiness means we're clean in our hearts. We don't have an attachment to money which is unhealthy. We're willing to give it when we have to give it. And there are people who are confused. Maybe let me take this opportunity to explain the structure of our giving. In the past, it was very straightforward. There were three types of tithes, the first and second and third tithe. So it was very clear for everybody. Today, many are confused about what do we give. So I've simplified 2 kinds of giving we do. We have a thanksgiving offering and we have a free will offering. The thanksgiving offering is the offering that you give every time you feel like giving thanks to God. Now, when we gather like this, and we're going to have an offering taken later today, that's a thanksgiving offering. Thank you for this wonderful weekend we've had. Thank you for keeping me here that I can be here, because there are others who wanted to be here, they are not here. Thank you that I'm healthy, that I'm here today. Thank you that I have a job. That's what we do when we give on a weekly basis into the collection basket. We're saying, thank you, Father, for what you've done for me for this week. Pastor Emmanuel talks about what they do in Ghana, where when people get a promotion at work, they give a thanksgiving offering to thank God for the promotion. When it's their birthday, they've completed another year of life. They bring a special offering called a thanksgiving offering to say, thank you for another year of my life. When their children pass matric or graduate, they come and say thank you to God for having blessed us with this. That's what a thanksgiving offering is. It is a practice of the Old Testament. Paul talks about it again. He says we must be people of thanksgiving. And then we have the free will offering. And we call it free will offering because it's not a text like the tithe was. The tithe was a text to look after the priesthood. So our regular offerings, our free will offerings, the percentage that you choose according to your own ability. It is up to you. You decide whether it's going to be 1% or 2% or 5% or 10% or 20% of your monthly income. That's the free will offering where you freely decide, not out of compulsion, but because you feel this is what I'll be able to afford to give. You must give that every month. Now there are people who don't do that. They think because they come to church and we're saying now we're going to take an offering, they look into their pockets and they have some change that they have in their pocket, then they give that. And they think they are giving a thanksgiving offering. That's not a Thanksgiving offering. A Thanksgiving offering is intentional. One of the words that we have been using this weekend, and there's a banner outside, we are an intentional group of people. Whatever we do it with intention. So we need to say, today I'm going to church, there's going to be an offering, how much am I going to give? And I'll pass by the ATM and get that money. So that my giving is not dependent on the change or the few cents that are in my wallet at the time of giving. It is an intentional decision that I've made. The same applies to the free will offering. I don't do my budget and then whatever is left, maybe I can do my monthly free will offering. No, upfront you decide. Before I get my salary, this is what I'm going to give. And the day it comes in, there is a debit order that goes through that takes the money and gives it where it's supposed to go. Because I've made up my mind about it. It's not something I still have to think every month, how much can I afford this month? I've just had a funeral, I've had to travel to Limpopo to a funeral, so my money this month doesn't balance out, therefore I can no longer give what I gave last month. No, it doesn't work like that. I give what I've decided I'm going to give out of my income. Whatever happens in my life during the month, it's something else. I'll take care of that. And God has always taken care of that. And those who give free will offerings will tell you He has always taken care of that. And that's what Jesus is saying. The number one commandment is to love God with all who we are and with all what we have. If we're not doing that, we're fooling ourselves to think we love God. Our homes, our cars belong to God. When something needs to be done, somebody needs to be carried somewhere and so on, our cars must be available. Our homes must be available. Our food must be available. If you need to host young people in your house for a Bible study or for a get-together and you need to feed them, that's what you do. If one child of those you that come there is going to be saved, Jesus says use your money to make those kind of decisions, to make those kinds of friends, those kinds of relationships that will last into eternity. That's what it's about. And that's what we are called to do in this passage. So let's conclude. I didn't put the verses there. This is from, I think, Timothy. It says, in the last days, men will be lovers of themselves. Lovers of themselves, not lovers of God or other people. Lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving. There's that word unholy. We heard about holiness yesterday. It's part of this thing. Okay? There's no holiness and there's no giving at the other end. Holy people, their hearts are clean. They are holy. They think of money in a healthy, holy way. They are unloving, they are unforgiving, they are slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. There's a practice that the Catholics have during the time of Lent, where they decide, okay, what is the thing that is my heart is stuck with that I need to get rid of? And for a month, they decide, I'm going to be without this thing. So if TV is their problem, for a month they won't watch TV. If drinking is their problem, for a month they won't drink. But not only they will not drink, the money they would have used to buy their whiskeys, they will give it. And we can learn from that. We can be lovers of God rather than lovers of pleasure. And Jesus in Matthew said, "Do not lay up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Unlike the shrewd manager, we will be making eternal friends with our money, with our wealth. The shrewd manager was not commended for his corruption. He was commended for knowing that you need friends. You need other people. And he says, how much more should us, the sons of light, want to reach out and make friendships that will not last just for this life, but for eternity? How much more? If an evil, corrupt businessman does that, only for a few years he's alive, how much should we do that for eternity? That's the point. So the commendation was not for the bad practices of the businessman. It was for the fact that he understands that relationships that last a long time are more valuable than any money. And when we talk about the love venue, we're talking about building relationships for people with us and with God that will last for eternity. That is what we are going for. This is a picture that we showed at the conference, which summarizes our vision, which needs, as I said, unfortunately, an infrastructure, both physical, spiritual, human, all kinds of resources are required. And in the world we live in, money talks. Without money, you can't do much of this. So my challenge to all of us is what we are putting together as a vision here. You will hear, those of you who were not part of the conference, you will get to hear more from your own pastors. We'll make the material available. We'll make sure that it's shared across the country so that everybody understands our Vision 2025. Now, for that vision to realize, it will need funding. Another parable that Jesus told was a man who wanted to build a house, but he didn't sit down and did the counting first to see how much it would cost him. So he just started building without counting the cost of the building. And halfway through, he ran out of money. And Jesus says, his neighbors laughed at him and said, "You are a fool. How can you start building when you don't know how much it will cost you? See, now you're stuck halfway. You can't finish your house." Now, we have decided on this vision knowing full well it will need money. And I believe that if this is a vision of God, God will move you to give what needs to be given for us to realize this. That's why we call it Together Towards Vision 2025. It's not something that I can do. It's not something that your pastor can do. It's something that we can do. And I pray that God may move us to do that. Amen.